Ousmane Dembele, who's been red hot recently, scoring goals, assisting goals, just looking absolutely brilliant. Do you think the signings of Kvaratskhelia and some of the other players who are in those attacking positions for PSG have kind of forced Ousmane Dembele to grow up and play better?
I mean, that's what competition's for, right?
The Champions League is back as well this week across our network as the knockout round playoff fixtures begin. 4 games on Tuesday and 4 games on Wednesday to look forward to. The early game on Tuesday is Brest against PSG, then 3 games at 3 p.m. Eastern, Juve against PSV, Manchester City against Real Madrid and Sporting against Borussia Dortmund. Then on Wednesday, the early game is Club Brugge against Atalanta. We've got Celtic, Bayern, Monaco, Benfica and Feyenoord against AC Milan, all at 3 p.m. Eastern as well. Chris, we've made our way to the wall to preview all of these matches. We're going to start with the big one, Manchester City versus Real Madrid at the Etihad. I wanted to mention the kind of curse for Erling Haaland, because he's not got a great record against Real Madrid. Do you see this as being the game where he ends that, or are they going to be able to keep him quiet?
Well, I do think that Erling Haaland has had some issues against the bigger teams, I think in general, because when they get into these big games, I think you see a lot of that space narrow, and it's about Erling Haaland's ability to operate in tight areas, which I don't think is the strong suit of his game. And so when things come quicker, the one thing I will say is this Real Madrid defense is really vulnerable coming into the game. You're probably going to see a starting central defensive partnership of Aurelien Tchouameni and probably one of the academy kids, one of the young players, your Jesus Vallejos, your Asensio, whoever is going to play in that position. It's not going to be a Real Madrid caliber player. Might not even have Ferland Mendy at left back, and Lucas Vazquez picked up an injury at right back at the weekend. So there's so many guys out that maybe he'll be able to get off of that difficult period against Real Madrid and in these big occasions. But I think he's got to prove it at this level, because I think you go back to when they won the Champions League, he didn't score from the quarterfinal on. And in some of these big games, he's found wanting. So I think this is a big one for him. You mentioned the defensive injuries there for Real Madrid. It is a bit of a crisis at the back. Do you think this is the weakest point in a team that Carlo Ancelotti has had to deal with in his time at Real Madrid all the way through? Not to be too mean, but he was the Everton manager once.
No, I mean at Real
Madrid. At Real Madrid. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
What
Oh, for sure.
Is for one position in the side, so across the defence, is this the weakest element he's had in all of his time there?
I think you'd have to say so, just based off of some of the players that are starting and getting minutes. I will say that in the Ancelotti era, they've kind of operated with a thinner team. It's not a team that is massively blessed for depth, that they have their 2 at every position. They like to play the same team and believe in their midfield of Kroos and Valverde and Modric, and then that front 3 of Vini Jr. And there weren't enormous Real Madrid star quality players on the bench like they used to have when they used to bring Mesut Ozil off the bench or Karim Benzema off the bench back before he really took over as a leading man when Cristiano Ronaldo left the club. So yeah, I think you look at this situation is dire. It's dire for Real Madrid. And I think the one thing that we've seen, even when they're healthy, is an imbalance in the team that, for me, when teams try and play against them, they can so often be found exposed because the front players don't press well enough. Sometimes Ancelotti will send his players to go at the opponent, try and recover the ball and play, but then they aren't good enough, and then the space behind them is so easy to play through. And so for Manchester City, they have to be looking to play through these spaces and find the opportunities in the game. They can now incorporate the new signings into games in the Champions League after the end of the league phase. So maybe you'll see Omar Marmoush pop up in these sorts of positions. But I think they have to figure out ways to play through this team, because earlier in this Champions League, when they were struggling, there are openings there if you can find them. For Real's troubles at the back, they've got an embarrassment of riches going forward. How do you think Kylian Mbappe and Vini Jr. are going to get on in this game? I think they're going to... I wonder if the smartest way for them to play, sit back and counter. And that's kind of how Real Madrid have played against Manchester City in these big ties, semifinal, quarterfinal, the Champions League. They will often sit back and defend for long periods and let you have the ball, especially with the first leg being at the Etihad. I think as long as they're within 3 goals going back home, they will feel that they can come back in a game. So I think in some ways the best way to get at this Man City team is let them commit numbers, and they just don't have the legs in midfield or the ability to really snuff out attacks at source. They're going to be able to find space, and Real Madrid have to find that space and punish it, which if there's anything in the world that Vini Jr., Mbappe, and Rodrigo can do is punish you in space.
Let's move on to the all-French affair, Brest versus PSG. Do you think this is where the fairy tale finally ends for Brest? They've obviously had a fabulous season in the Champions League. I don't think anyone expected them to reach even this stage, because when you look at the domestic record in Ligue 1 that they've got against PSG, it is absolutely woeful.
Right, and I think in some ways that is the anticlimax of them getting this draw, because honestly for them, coming into the Champions League, finishing 24th is the dream. It's beyond our wildest expectations. Then all of a sudden they found themselves in the top 8. They played Real Madrid on the final day of the league phase. They couldn't win the game. They still, though, have the second leg going back home. I do think, to your point, it's very difficult to overcome that mental hurdle of playing against the team that dominates your domestic division. That realistically, your dreams of getting to the Champions League are to play other big teams, not the team that so often beats you domestically and so often wins that league. It kind of feels like, oh man, this is our draw. The only hope is that they have that second leg back at home. They can keep it close. Even if they lose 2-1 or 3-2 or 1-0, they can go back into that second leg. They'll have an enormous atmosphere behind them, and maybe that's what gets them over the line. And so it's gotten them over the line to this point. So I think it's the dream that you have of just keep it close going back home so we can have something to play for. But I can understand why this draw, when it came out of the hat, is like, PSG, really?
And they're going to have to find a way to deal with Ousmane Dembele, who's been red hot recently, scoring goals, assisting goals, just looking absolutely brilliant. Do you think the signings of Kvaratskhelia and some of the other players who are in those attacking positions for PSG have kind of forced Ousmane Dembele to grow up and play better?
I mean, that's what competition's for, right? I think Dembele has these incredibly streaky periods. I'm not going to believe this is who he is now unless he's like that for half a season, a full season. We've always known. There's a reason for as much as Barcelona have been pilloried for spending more than 100 million on Ousmane Dembele and not getting much for him. The reason why they spend more than 100 million is because he's a brilliant talent. He was amazing at Borussia Dortmund, but in periods. And the finishing lets him go. And I remember commentating in their games in the quarterfinals of last year's Champions League. He has 1 goal in the whole season. And now all of a sudden he's gone on this spurt. Maybe the competition is part of the reason why, but he's played in other clubs where they're competitive environments and they're great players behind him. So I don't know if this is all of a sudden the time that he's finally figured it out and he's going to become a consistent goal scorer, but I don't think the competition hurt. I don't think Kvara coming in, Desiree Doué, I think, has had a much better second half of the season than a lot of people might have expected. You would expect a young French player to slowly grow into life at PSG. He's kind of become a regular starter for them. They have so much talent in this team. Gonzalo Ramos up front. They have so many great players, and I think it's not a massive surprise that we're starting to see Dembele find a level of consistency.
One of the really interesting ties for me, and a difficult one to call, is Juventus against PSV Eindhoven. They're one of the teams that played in the league phase. It was a 3-1 victory for Juventus that day. How do you think this Juventus team are going to be able to perform against PSV Eindhoven? I suppose on the negative side for the Dutch side, obviously Ricardo Pepi, they've lost him through injury, but they have had some good performances. They beat Liverpool, didn't they? I know it was a kind of a dead rubber and Liverpool made a load of changes, but they're still going to take that confidence into this game.
Well, and I think they've seen the vulnerability that Juventus proposed, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, without wishing to seem overly myopic, I do think in real football terms, not having the Americans available, Serginho Dest has been out, obviously he had a long-term injury towards the end of last season. Malik Tillman has been honestly one of the best creative players in the whole of the Champions League, and then no Pepi up front. Those are big misses. And then really the coup de grace is, I think, some of the other issues that they've had in the team. They've been a little bit more vulnerable domestically, and so I think PSV are a team that are really happy to be here. They honestly have the kind of draw where you go, maybe we could do something, but until an Eredivisie side steps up at this level and really puts a team like this to the sword, I'm not necessarily going to believe in it, especially with the key players that are up.
What about Juventus? Kolo Muani, for me, has made such a difference recently since he's come in, scoring goals. This team just looks like it's had a shot in the arm and been reinvigorated by this guy. Well,
I think the biggest thing that a good striker can provide this Juventus team is margin for error, because they've had so many matches this season where I feel like they perform well. The movement is great. The way that Malta is implementing the system is great, but no punishers. Dusan Vlahovic hasn't been healthy enough. There hasn't been enough clinical goal scoring. And all of a sudden, from 1.8 XG, you've got 5 goals in 3 games. You're going, man, if Kolo Muani can just be this guy, for Juventus. I'm not certain he's going to be. Scoring 5 goals from your 5 shots on target after joining a new club kind of feels like that new bump, like finally I can play, because he had such a rough go of it for 18 months at Paris Saint-Germain. So I'm not necessarily a big believer, and this is Randall Kolo Muani, who he's going to be for Juventus, but the biggest thing he's provided for them is, maybe in games where, Como outplayed them for stretches in that away match, and yet they managed to get victories because Kolo Muani is finishing his chances. That's just what they lacked up until this point, and all of a sudden they're winning games and scoring multiple goals in games, which felt like such a slog for them for the first few months of the season.
Good to see a smile back on his face as well, because I think he went through, as you mentioned,
again, obviously a brilliant player. When someone spends $95 million on you, you're really good. It has to be the right environment, and clearly Juventus, at least in the early stages, has been the right environment.
Yeah, he's enjoying himself playing under Thiago Motta. Let's move it on to Feyenoord against AC Milan, another one that's quite tricky to call. Loads of storylines coming into this one. Feyenoord sacked their manager, Brian Prisky, just 48 hours before this game, which was an interesting choice. Then they didn't have someone to name as a replacement because the coach is left with him. They've said that they're going to announce the interim on Tuesday, which kind of makes it sound like they haven't got someone lined up and they're just hammering the phones to find someone who's available.
Who do we get?
So this is a side that's in turmoil coming into this game against AC Milan.
Which, kind of, if I were a Feyenoord fan, I'd be so upset. Never mind you let Santi Jimenez go to Milan.
Why now?
Right.
If I was a fan, obviously you might know a little bit more kind of into the behind the scenes, but you're thinking, why are you doing this now? Well,
especially because Feyenoord had that famous result at home against Bayern Munich in the league phase. Maybe just the form in the league just got to the point where you've got to let him go, but I still think that this was the game for them. They're at home. You have to take advantage of being at home in the first leg. You've beaten Bayern already in the league phase, facing a Milan team, which is kind of there for the taking. That's there for... we're not particularly a strong-willed team that's going to put in a great away performance. If Feyenoord can beat any team of the kind of heavy hitters in the Champions League at home and have an advantage going to the second leg, it would be this Milan team. And then the biggest move that happened beyond the managerial situation is Santi Jimenez now goes playing for your team to playing for the team that you're facing in the Champions League. So you understand a club like Feyenoord have to take the money when you can get the money. They're a develop and sell league, develop and sell team. But it just feels like it's an opportunity miss, because this was a tie that I looked at and go, if there was to be a giant killing, I think in this round, it would probably be this one. But I don't think in their current state, managerial turmoil, striker missing up front, that they're going to be that team.
How's Christian Pulisic going to get on in this one? Do you think this is his stage to shine, isn't it?
Well, and it's his stage now to figure out how to play with Santiago Jimenez and play with Kyle Walker, who is his right back partner, and with Joao Felix just playing in the middle. In some ways, this team is materially different from the one, and they made 7 moves on deadline day. So it's materially different. So he, once again, is put in a position to try and figure out life with the new striker up front, with Rafael Leao and Teo Hernandez hopefully combining a little bit better and getting into the attack with changes in midfield. So I think for this Milan team, it's about figuring out the whole, right? Figuring out the collective, because Conceição has clearly come in and taken a battering ram to this team and said, don't like this guy, give me this guy, don't like this guy, give me this guy. And so Pulisic has got to reacquaint himself with the rest of this team. And the biggest thing for them, they have to start games well. They have to come out in the first half of the game and show that they're ready to deliver a level of performance, because it's been so many games now where they don't start well.